Hello everyone, it's Oskar here at Virtual Factula, and today I'll be talking about a subject that comes up quite a lot on Facebook and Instagram and such. And that's sparring longswords. Are they any sort of useful, and if so, which models are good? I know what some of you are thinking. Oskar, this is not a Montanto or a Messer. Everything okay at home? Well, yeah. I do a lot of longsword, of course, and I don't often show it here on this channel, and that's because there's a lot of other people who are doing longsword. It's not particularly a niche weapon now, is it? And that means that a lot of other people are saying a lot of sensible things about it already, and I don't feel that I have just that much to add to that. That said, I don't see any other YouTubers talk about this particularly much right now, so for this video we'll dive into the Forbidden Messer and see which sparring longsword are nice. Now, that means that first I'll be looking at what is a sparring longsword in the first place, how is it different from a reenactment longsword or from a fader, and after that we'll be having a look at two particular specimens that I managed to have in my hands, the first being the Sigi King, and the second, this one, the Malleus Martialis Todesca. So what's the deal with these sparring longswords? They seem to want to strike some sort of a balance between the safety features of a fader, which is the flex and the relatively low impact, and the handling characteristics of a blunt longsword. To try and combine these characteristics in one longsword simulator is a relatively new development over here, and to understand why this is the case, we need to go back in time. No, not that far back. Ah well, since we're here anyway, let's just have a look at what's going on. See, they have faders, but they're not quite like modern HEMA faders. The origin of the word fader is somewhat unclear. From the 16th century on, we find the term vechtschwert, fencing sword, quite often. The term vechtfader seems to not have been used at the time, but since language is a living thing, we call these things faders nowadays, I'll try to stick to that for the purpose of this video. These guys are using their faders for fencing without protective gear. In case of the Fechtschule in German and Middle European cities, the bouts were decided by judging who had taken the highest bleeding wound. In Franco-Belgian guild fencing, they'd be targeting the torso, upper arms and head with the flat of the blade. As such, these faders had blades with rather wide but thin spatulated points tapering to become very narrow near the cross, including some sort of a shield. These Fechtschwerter were therefore built quite differently from an actual sword, in order to perform a far less lethal type of fighting than what these swords were actually meant for. So now let's go a bit forward in time, to around 2010 to be precise. Ah, yeah, excellent. That's pretty much what it looked like back then. Like, absolute. It was basically just cobbled together protective items from whatever other activities involved sudden and violent kinetic energy transfers, paired with either steel swords for reenactment or some very floppy nylon swords. And then I didn't even mention the shinais with crossguards mounted to them. Such reenactment swords could sometimes be absolutely amazing reproductions with great handling. They were not particularly safe for sparring though, with somewhat thinner edges and acute points. Besides, the flex on these swords was nothing to write home about. At this exact moment in HEMA history though, everything was about to change. The time of the fader had come. Some of the leading fencers in our community, together with a couple of sword makers, started to really push for a sparring-safe longsword that had many features in common with the Fechtschwerter. These blades weren't forged out into an edge, or the blade's mass was brought closer to the handle by adding a shield, which could also help protect the hand. However, while the original Fechtschwerter weren't meant for thrusting, the new faders had rolled tips and a lot of flex to make thrusts at high intensity possible. This pretty much kickstarted a new golden age for longsword fencing. It simply got a lot easier to spar and compete in longsword with these things, without having to deal with the sometimes hilariously bad artifacts of using simulators made of different materials such as wood and nylon. The fader has come to symbolize modern HEMA, and I think this is overall great development. The fader is here to stay. But I will say that faders handle quite a bit differently from actual longswords. Granted, a blunt longsword also doesn't replicate a sharp longsword 100%, but it comes a lot closer. Added to this, over the last 10 years or so, faders have been becoming ever longer and stiffer. Get your minds out of the gutter. But this does mean that the handling is influenced. Whereas most longswords are somewhat around the 120 centimeter mark, or sometimes even shorter, the average fader nowadays is 135 centimeters. And this does affect handling quite a bit, and as a result it also affects people's fencing styles. This means that ultimately there always was a bit of a market for something that has the handling characteristics of a longsword, but also the safety features of a fader. Now, granted, faders will handle abuse a bit better, so I don't see swords like this replacing faders anytime soon, but they're quite interesting to have next to a fader. So these sparring longswords are interesting for people who don't necessarily do competitive bouts but want to focus on more technical fencing, but also on people who do want to do competitive bouts but want to experience what it's like to do that with something that comes very close to a longsword. And I do think they very much have a use in that way, and that they do enhance your fencing experience if you from time to time try fencing with something that comes very close to an actual sword. Now this all seems to be a relatively new development over here. Of course, in the US you have Albion making the Lichtenauer model, but besides that, in Europe only a couple of makers were making swords that were kind of like both suitable to sparring and handled like an actual longsword. And this all kind of changed when Black Fencer introduced their steel line a couple of years back. And since then, Sigiforge brought out the King, and last year Maleus Martialis started selling the Todesca, which I have over here, and it seems other makers are following suit as well. I am in the very fortunate position to own a Todesca Type 3, and my clubmate Nick has a Sigi King. So we thought it would be pretty fun to do a bit of a side-by-side comparison to see what the characters of these blades are like and what their strengths and weaknesses are. So let's start with the stats. You could be forgiven to think that both of these swords are pretty much similar just based on the stats, but this couldn't be further from the truth. They each have a very outspoken character that I'll touch upon in a minute. But first let's have a look at areas where they perform very similarly, which is safety and durability. The safety features of these blades are quite good. Now, granted, they don't have a shield like a fader would have, so you have to be a little bit more skilled to keep your thumb out of harm's way. And of course this also means that you have to control your blows a little bit more than with a fader, but I still think that's just within reasonable limits. Unlike some faders, these blades will actually flex when you thrust someone, and quite generously so. The flex on both these swords is absolutely very good. And another thing I like very much is the fact that they have thickened tips rather than rolled tips. Now, the thing with these rolled tips is that they tend to break off at the most inopportune moments, and if they somehow get into a glove, there's no telling what they might scoop at. So generally speaking, I think these thickened tips are a lot better. When it comes to durability, you have to be quite smart about using both of these blades. Faders will quite simply stand abuse better since they have thicker edges. So if you have a Todesca or a King and you put it up against other people in your club who are using faders, you might want to check your edges for damage from time to time. So I have been using my Todesca against other people in the club who are using faders, and so far, yes, there's a little bit of edge damage, but nothing terribly serious. So no really sharp burrs or cracks or other structural damage going on. So I think if you're smart about it, you can enjoy your Todesca or your King for quite a long time. As an added bonus, the Todesca has a fully demountable construction, so if at some point you replace the blade, you can just swap out your hilt components, a new blade, and just mount them yourself. And that's nice, I think. Now for the handling. It's here that we realize that these swords are different beasts. The Todesca is a longsword that has some characteristics of a fader, and the King, by contrast, is a fader that has some characteristics of a longsword. Now, neither of these is a bad thing, mind you, but it does mean that they'll appeal to different audiences. The Todesca just feels ridiculously light and really well balanced. This thing weighs actually 1400 grams, but when I hand it to someone and I ask them to estimate the weight, usually they guess around like a kilo or sometimes even less. It just feels that light. It's really the closest I think a blunt longsword can get to the feeling of an actual sharp longsword. And that means that the Todesca will pretty much do anything you want it to do, and in true Italian fashion make it look completely effortless. There are some problems though. First off, it's the length. With 125 centimeters, it's a bit on the short side. So if you go up against other people who have faders that are like 10 centimeters longer, you might experience some problems. And if you're used to a long fader yourself as well, this might be a bit of a rude awakening at first. The other thing is that the grip, of course, is on the short side as well. And I think it's perfectly proportioned. It looks absolutely great. And with bare hands and with light gloves and even medium gloves, it's absolutely no problem. It's perfectly fitted. However, with the bulk of some heavy gloves, you might find that you have a little space there. And especially since it has a wheel pommel, gripping the pommel isn't fully comfortable. So with heavy gloves, you might get in trouble with this particular longsword. Now, by contrast, the King might not necessarily handle as well as the Todesca. Sure, it's a lot livelier and better balanced and feels nicer in the hand than most faders, but it quite simply just loses out in competition. Part of the reason for that, though, is its length. And with that length, the King can pretty much compete with any fader on the market for reach. And it's quite simply the, well, king of the thrusting game. Durchwechseln was never easier. Finally, the grip is long enough to comfortably accommodate heavy gloves, and just in case, the pommel has a shape that's very suitable for gripping as well, giving you a couple of extra centimeters if needed. Now, that all means that the Todesca is most interesting to people who want to experience something as close to fighting with a sharp sword as possible, while still having something that's very safe and flexible, and you can spar with at high intensity. On the other hand, the King is really amazing for people who want to take the feeling of a blunt longsword into competitive bouts where this blade will still shine. Quite simply put, the Todesca is a sword with the characteristics of a fader, and the King is a fader with the characteristics of a longsword. And this will very much decide which of these two swords you like best. Now, anyway, that's it for now, folks. I hope you enjoyed that one. Let me know in the comments whether you think that the sparring longswords are a good and useful thing. And of course, as per usual, don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And finally, also check out Patreon if you're interested in more Messer, Montante and longsword goodness. Thanks to my patrons, I can make better videos and their help is much appreciated. So thanks a lot. And finally, I'll say goodbye until the next video by saying, as is only right and proper, okay doei.